Have you ever wondered why some stories make us look twice into the darkness? What makes certain stories so remarkable that we continue to think about them days or even years later? Perhaps it's the fact that, deep down, we all know that the inexplicable is closer than we think. Now imagine living that, returning to a place you call home, only to discover that it carries shadows that never really left. Tonight, we'll bring you real stories of people who dared to face the unknown, accounts ranging from abandoned villages where time seems to have stood still to encounters with mysterious figures that defy any rational explanation. Every word, every detail was lived and told by those who felt the chill down their spine and the fear take over. But here's the real terror. What would you do if, in an apparently empty place, something was watching you? A scarecrow dressed in human clothes, a familiar voice that doesn't belong to someone who should be alive, or that unmistakable feeling that something is following you, even if you're alone. Prepare yourself. These aren't just horror tales. They are echoes of a world where the unknown is lurking, waiting to be discovered. Are you ready to face it? It was a village like many others, full of memories that stood the test of time. Until the mid-1980s, the village was teeming with life. Whole families gathered for parties, children ran through the dirt streets, and the sound of laughter filled the air. However, like many small communities scattered across the countryside, the village began to empty out when job opportunities migrated to the big urban centers. For those who stayed, things changed drastically. In 1985, a series of events sealed the village's fate. First, an economic crisis led to the bankruptcy of the largest factory in the region, leaving dozens of families without a livelihood. Shortly afterwards, reports of criminal activity began to circulate, causing the few remaining residents to live in constant fear. By 1990, the village was almost completely deserted, with only a few hardy souls who refused to abandon their roots. Returning to such a place decades later is like walking through an abandoned painting. The colors have faded, the stories have been forgotten, but the feeling remains. The first sight of the ruined houses taken over by the bush brought back an avalanche of memories for the protagonist. He remembered how he used to play in the main square and how the nights were lit by small oil lamps. But now, all that remained were silences and shadows. That afternoon, while walking through the streets that once seemed so wide, he came across what remained of Dona Conceção's old grocery store. The building was standing, but battered by time, with doors creaking in the wind. Inside, the few products on the shelves were covered in dust, and the smell of abandonment was unmistakable. It was there that he learned that Justino, a childhood friend, still lived in the same house. This unexpected reunion was just what he needed to delve even deeper into his memories, but it was also the start of something he would never forget. When past and present meet, sometimes what emerges is not comfort, but a portal to the darkest secrets that memory has tried to bury. Walking through a deserted village where silence is louder than any sound is like being trapped in a limbo between the past and the present. The isolation that covers these places goes beyond geography. It penetrates the souls of those who dare to stay behind or those who venture to return. Loneliness seems to take shape there, making every shadow longer and every noise more threatening. For the protagonist, this vulnerability began to manifest itself at dusk, when the empty streets began to reflect his own restlessness. The wind whistled between the roofless houses and the sunlight faded, making the atmosphere increasingly gloomy. At that moment, he noticed something curious. The further he walked, the more it seemed that the invisible eyes of the village were following him. They weren't just memories, but a real feeling of being watched, something almost tangible in the still air. This kind of isolation creates a devastating psychological effect. Studies show that abandoned places often arouse a feeling of unease and fear, because human beings are biologically programmed to look for signs of life around them. The absence of movement, sound, or presence intensifies the feeling of vulnerability, leaving the mind susceptible to imagining unseen dangers. On arriving at Giustino's house, the protagonist felt a brief sense of relief. Finally, a human connection in the middle of the emptiness. However, the emotional vulnerability was palpable. Giustino lived in isolation, like a survivor of a world that everyone had forgotten. The reunion brought back old memories, but also raised unsettling questions. How can someone survive so long in a place that seems dead? And, more importantly, what kept them there? Physical and psychological isolation becomes a trap. The protagonist begins to realize that loneliness not only consumes, but also attracts. It is in this environment that the boundaries between the real and the imaginary begin to blur. He wonders, is isolation a state of abandonment or an open door to something much more sinister? What we see can't always be explained by logic. In the protagonist's case, the first signs of something beyond comprehension appeared as apparently harmless details. A scarecrow in the field, dressed in human clothes, was just a peculiar ornament from a distance. However, the more he looked at the figure, the more it seemed to take on a life of its own, as if it were watching his every move. Connections with the supernatural are not limited to isolated events. They create a pattern. The protagonist noticed that certain moments carried a strange repetition, like the sound of the wind that seemed to whisper indecipherable words, or the dim light that flashed on the horizon with no apparent source. These anomalies, although subtle, began to form a network of events that got out of hand. Studies into unexplained phenomena suggest that the human mind is highly susceptible to illusory patterns. However, some situations simply defy all rational explanations. For example, the scarecrow's behavior could be dismissed as imagination, but the voice he heard from the field calling for help was not something he could ignore. The presence of the supernatural often manifests itself when there is an emotional or energetic imbalance. Giustino, who had spent years isolated in that village, carried a weight with him that seemed to attract these invisible forces. He mentioned old stories passed down from generation to generation about spirits who protected the countryside, but who turned against the villagers when they weren't respected. In one of the most tense moments, the protagonist felt a presence around the house, something that couldn't be seen, but was certainly there. Giustino, already used to these manifestations, advised him not to react, to ignore it. "They don't like attention," he said, as if he were talking about wild animals. But ignoring the inexplicable is almost impossible when it's all around you, testing the limits of your sanity. This connection with the unknown made it clear that the village was not just a place forgotten by time, but a zone where the barriers between the real and the spiritual had been eroded. The protagonist realized that leaving would be more difficult than entering, as he now carried the marks of what he had encountered. Perhaps, like Justin, he could never really escape. Guilt is a silent but constant weight that creeps up in moments of vulnerability. For the protagonist, it was directly linked to childhood memories and past mistakes. Among the ruins of the village, every corner seemed to remind him of actions he would rather forget, like the times he mocked Giustino for his poverty. He carried the shame of having participated in cruelties that, although common among children, left deep scars on those who lived through them. Giustino, on the other hand, seemed to have overcome his traumas. When the protagonist brought up his apologies, Giustino simply replied, "I forgave that a long time ago. You were just a child." However, Justin's forgiveness didn't diminish the internal pain of those who recognized the impact of their actions. This exchange revealed a common paradox. It is easier to forgive others than oneself. The journey through the village brought lessons about how guilt can shape our perception of the world. The scarecrow in the field, the mysterious presence at night, all seemed amplified by the protagonist's emotional state. Psychological studies show that emotions such as guilt and remorse can increase sensitivity to external stimuli, creating a perception of threat where it may not exist. However, forgiveness has a transformative power. In the conversation with Justin, the protagonist began to understand that the past could not be changed, but that the present offered the opportunity for reparation. By helping Justino fix little things around the house or sharing old stories, he felt for the first time that it might be possible to balance the scales. In the end, Justino's forgiveness was not only for the protagonist, but also for himself. He recognized that holding on to grievances only reinforced the shadows that surrounded him, while letting go of bitterness was the only way to some kind of peace. For the protagonist, this was the hardest lesson, to accept that, even with mistakes, he could still be worthy of redemption. Guilt creates monsters in our minds, but forgiveness, both received and given, has the power to dispel these creatures. As the night progressed, the protagonist realized that the real battle was internal. What was out there, in the countryside or in the village, was only a reflection of what he carried inside. Some stories stay with us because they speak directly to what is most human: fear, guilt, and the search for redemption. When the protagonist returned to the village of his childhood, he faced not only the shadows of the past, but also the echoes of the unknown. He learned that true terror lies not only in what surrounds us, but also in what we carry within us. The village, with its abandoned houses and hidden secrets, became the scene of a personal transformation. Justin, the scarecrow, the invisible presence, all were fragments of a puzzle that tested the limits of his courage and sanity. But in the end, the most important lesson was clear. Forgiveness, even in the midst of fear, is a powerful force that can free us from the bonds of the past. And for you, what would be left by returning to a place that holds both your history and your deepest fears? The answer lies not in what we find, but in what we choose to face. After all, sometimes the only way to escape the shadows is to turn on a light and face them head-on.